It took me a while to realise that what I saw must have been a ghost, and to this day, thinking about it still chills me to my core. It happened approximately 25 years ago. I was working at an antiquarian bookstore in Uptown, New York. The store was approximately 25 miles east of Rochester. This is when I had my only direct visual interaction with a supernatural entity. I remember it very clearly because the owner of the bookstore had been involved in a minor traffic accident just a few days before. The insurance adjusters were at the store, in the parking lot out the back, taking photos of his van. The time was approximately 9 o'clock in the morning. The only other employee inside the store was positioned perfectly to see this thing that I saw, and she swears that she saw nothing. I entered the store and stood there talking to her briefly, as I looked to my right down the classic literature section, and that is when I saw it. I know it was not a hallucination, and I was stone cold sober, having only had a coffee that morning. A few hours later, when I was heading out to my coffee break, I casually asked my co-worker if she had seen what I had seen. It was perfectly in her line of sight, so there was absolutely no way she wouldn't have seen it. What I saw was as real as day, but she absolutely insisted that she hadn't seen it. Again, this thing that I saw was perfectly in her line of sight, so this just seemed impossible to me. I remember almost getting annoyed with her because she is not the type to mess about. She is old school New England and is about the most honest person I've ever met. She swore blind that there was absolutely nothing there and probably presumed that I was on drugs. I should mention that the bookstore isn't just filled with books, but really old books, including an edition of Athanasius Kircher's Epidus Aegyptiacus from the 1600s. This book, in particular, is valued at around $3 million. The store also has a display of old hats and antiques from various time periods. So, going back to what I'd seen earlier that day, I was working on the computer, carrying out some data entry, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I got the feeling I was being watched. It was an unwavering feeling, and I couldn't resist the urge to look up. When I looked up from the computer, I was shocked to see a very tall, very stoic man dressed in full Native American regalia. I mean feathered headdress, buckskin leggings, etc. I hadn't heard anybody come into the store, and I definitely would have noticed if someone had have walked past me. I froze in shock, and I really didn't know how to react. He wasn't looking at the books on the shelf. He was standing there, with his arms folded, looking directly at me. He seemed to have nodded slightly, so I awkwardly nodded back. I looked over at my co-worker, who at this point was talking to me, and seemed to have no acknowledgement of this man standing in full Native American attire. Talking to her later, it became abundantly clear that she really hadn't seen him, and that what I had seen must have been a ghost. The weird thing is, the store burned down less than 2 weeks later. I sometimes wonder if that entity was trying to warn me about potential danger. I don't know for sure, but I do know that it was definitely the strangest experience of my life, and I'll never forget it. Back in the 1980s, I lived with some roommates who had a fascination with Ouija boards. Eventually, shit got so scary that I had to leave. I had 3 roommates who started using the board. Initially, it didn't work much, but they kept trying until they got a decent response. Before long, fascination turned into addiction, and they were using the board all the time. On Friday night, the whole thing came to a terrifying climax. What happened that night changed me from an absolute skeptic to a definite believer in the paranormal. I worked until 11 PM and got home slightly later than usual that night. The planchette seemed to be flying around the board as if it was possessed. When I walked into the room, everyone was excitedly talking about a little girl who had come through on the board. Apparently, the girl had passed away in the 1920s. Whatever. I wasn't a believer, so I went to my room and turned on the TV. I could still hear them all speaking loudly, when all of a sudden the mood in that room seemed to change. The excitement soon dissipated and was replaced by an air of uncertainty and apprehension. It appeared that the young girl had now stopped communicating, and a different spirit had taken control of the board. Out of sheer curiosity, I came out of my room to see what was going on. A spirit kept alternating between the letters C and Z, so my friends decided to call it Chaz. This was around 86 or 87, so my friends started to speculate that maybe this was Zozo. I had no idea who or what Zozo was. So, just for context, Zozo or Zaza is an Ouija board demon who manifests with the sole purpose of driving his victims insane before killing them. One of my friends started taunting the spirit, saying if it was such a powerful entity, why couldn't it do anything away from the board? The room grew quiet, but nothing happened. Well, for a while at least. The energy in the room did seem to shift though. I can't really explain it. It just felt ominous. My friends discussed ending the session and saying goodbye to Chaz. But Chaz had different ideas. The Christmas lights that were hung around the ceiling started blinking. Bear in mind, this was the 1980s, so we didn't have fairy lights with remotes. These were white lights on a dark green wire, and they only blinked if you removed the first bulb on the string. Other than that, they are steady, solid white lights, and nobody ever removed that first bulb to make them blink. They had been hung around the ceiling in that room since September, and they never blinked. And yet, they started blinking, and even as the total skeptic that I was, this shocked the shit out of me. Then, I noticed that one of my friends was fixated on something. He was pointing towards a small side table that we had in that room. She had a look of absolute terror on her face, and we all stopped and noticed exactly what she was looking at. This huge, heavy glass ashtray that one of my friends had stolen from a hotel in New Hampshire was vibrating on that table. Soon, the vibrating intensified, and the ashtray started rocking backwards and forwards on that table before sliding towards my friends. Without warning, before our very eyes, the ashtray launched itself at the wall right next to me, smashing into 3 pieces on the floor. Everyone totally flipped out, and I'm not going to lie, that includes me too. We quickly turned on the lights, blew the candles out, and brought the session to an end. Shortly after this, maybe a week or two later, my roommate went to stay with her boyfriend for the weekend. As usual, I finished work at 11 p.m. and I was hit with a really uneasy feeling as I walked into our shared bedroom. I really felt like I was being watched, so I turned on the TV to ease my anxiety. I left the TV on, but turned the volume right down before I fell asleep, and I placed the remote control on the bedside table next to me. I closed my eyes, and before long, I had drifted off to sleep. At some point in the night, I was woken up abruptly by a crashing sound, and the volume on that TV had been turned right up. Shocked and in a daze, I looked around the room and noticed that the remote control was now in pieces on the floor on the other side of the room. Batteries were on the floor next to it. Needless to say, I was absolutely petrified, and I moved out of that room that night. I went to stay with some other friends until the end of semester. This experience has totally altered my perception of the supernatural. I just sincerely hope that I never encounter anything like this again. Have you ever had an experience with an Ouija board? When I was younger, my father lived just across from a graveyard, which, at the time, I thought was the coolest thing in the world. From a very young age, I had always been fascinated with the paranormal. However, there was a particular incident that occurred in that house that absolutely chilled me to my core. There was a very large field of weeds and dry grass that went up to our knees, in between the road that we live on and the graveyard. This kind of added to the already eerie atmosphere. The second we arrived at my dad's house, I was upset to learn that me and my little sister had to sleep in the basement alone. There were 13 red steps leading down into the basement, which I found really creepy, but my dad just laughed at my concern. At this age, I didn't really know all that much about the paranormal and links between evil and certain numbers, but I had a really negative feeling about those stairs. We listened intently to what sounded like a woman's faint voice trying to lure us out into the darkness. I felt a really strong urge to follow the voice, but something felt off about the situation and instinct kicked in, so I made sure that I stayed with my sister to keep her safe. This must have made the woman really mad, because on the second or third night, activity in that basement really seemed to escalate. We started hearing someone walking up and down the stairs repeatedly, and sometimes it sounded like they were walking on all fours. We always heard the voice whispering, but we tried our best to ignore it. It was so quiet, but we could both definitely hear it, and up until this point, it didn't really seem to pose us any real threat. However, that night something happened that changed my life and how I perceived the paranormal forever. The activity down in the basement really seemed to have gone up a level. That voice now sounded angry. The air felt and sounded like what I can only describe as static, and there was more movement coming out of the darkness than usual. We heard her run down the stairs. This absolutely terrified the both of us, and my little sister whimpered and climbed onto my mattress next to me. I grabbed her as tightly as I could, and we both scooted backwards against the wall. My sister hid her head under the blanket, and I really wish that I'd done the same. I stared into the darkness in anticipation of what was about to come. And in that moment, she finally manifested and presented herself physically for the very first time. In the top left corner of the doorway, she finally emerged, poking her head
into the room. But something was very, very wrong. I tried my best not to scream for my sister's sake, and to be honest, I was just frozen in fear. I tried my best not to make eye contact, and after what seemed like an eternity, it quickly pulled its head back into the darkness behind the wall. I grabbed my sister and dragged her into the small bathroom connected to our bedroom. Whenever I explained to people what happened, I was never totally honest about the most significant detail about the events that transpired that night. I always said it was a girl with long black hair and a pale face, which wasn't too far from the truth. However, my whole life I've tried convincing myself that that was the real story, because the truth of it was way too terrifying even for me to believe. The girl did have long black hair, and she did have a pale face. But what terrified me is that it was my hair and my face. It looked exactly like me, but pale, malnourished, and, well, dead. I had always been praised and complimented for my very long hair, but after this happened, I cut it to my shoulders. I could no longer face seeing her every time I looked in the mirror. Recently, I asked my sister what she remembers about that house, and that night in particular. Thankfully, she has no memory of it ever happening. I think it may have been too traumatizing for her to remember. She was 3 years younger than me, so maybe she was just too young. I definitely won't be stirring those memories up for her, because, to be honest, I wish I could forget them too. Today, I want to share a story that changed me from a skeptic to a believer in the paranormal. This may be a long one, so please bear with me. I want to take you back to 2009. Our family had been looking for a new house for a while now, and near a busy highway stood this beautiful house. 2 stories, a spacious front and backyard, 3 bedrooms, etc. We fell in love with this house, so my parents placed an offer which was accepted, and we moved in soon after. As I already said, I didn't believe in ghosts before moving to this house. I was young and had never had any paranormal experiences up until this point. However, there were some strange occurrences relatively early on. For example, our family computer liked to turn on when nobody was around, and the water in the bath would start running on its own. However, the real horror began when my oldest sister decided to create a makeshift Ouija board. Essentially, she drew one herself on a piece of paper and used a glass to communicate. My younger sister got really scared when she realised what was happening, and she kicked the paper away. Well, soon after this, everything got worse. A lot worse. My sisters shared the biggest bedroom, and at the end of the bedroom was a little closet where they kept boxes, games, toys and things like that. Initially, the door to the closet was always closed, but after a while, it started opening on its own, and before long, it simply refused to stay shut. No matter what, that closet door just kept opening on its own. Eventually, my dad got really annoyed with it, so he placed something in between the door and the wall to stop the door from opening. One night, when everyone was in their beds, I heard what sounded like chairs downstairs moving and scraping across the kitchen floor. I was the last one to leave the living room and go upstairs to bed that night, so I knew for absolute certain there was nobody down there. Everybody else was already in bed. I listened intently until the sounds of the scraping chairs stopped. Not long after that, I started hearing this really awful sound. It was as if something was inside the walls and underneath the flooring, tearing everything apart. It was incredibly loud. I remember hiding under my blanket, absolutely terrified. The next morning, when I woke up and went downstairs for breakfast, my mum asked me why I'd stacked all the chairs on top of each other in the kitchen. Obviously, I said that I hadn't, and the expression on my mum's face looked fearful. I could tell straight away that she believed me. Another time, we were all in the living room watching our favourite TV show, sitting on the couch with the dog next to us. My mum had some small collectible figurines on the table. Suddenly, one of the figurines launched itself across the room, as if somebody had thrown it. My mum jokingly said, "Hey, no need to get so aggressive." She was trying her best to make light of the situation so that me and my sisters wouldn't get scared. But there was no hiding it. There was fear in her tone, and I could sense it. One morning, my sister ran into my parents' bedroom screaming hysterically. She said that she was in the kitchen at the table eating breakfast on her own, and the chair next to her at the table pulled itself out from underneath the table on its own. Our dog started behaving way more aggressively in certain rooms in the house. She would stand staring at the sofa, growling and barking as if somebody was sitting there. She especially hated the basement and wouldn't go anywhere near the basement door. One night, I was woken up by the sound of my mum screaming. I ran as fast as I could into their bedroom to find out what was going on. My mum was sat upright in bed, and my dad was still lying down next to her. I asked what was wrong. She just said, "It was nothing, honey, just a bad dream. Go back to bed." She later confessed that this wasn't the case at all. My mum had been woken up that night by the sound of whispering in her ear. When she opened her eyes, there was a black figure standing next to her bed. She couldn't really describe it. She just said that it was like a black shadow, but it was standing there right next to her. We started hearing what sounded like somebody playing a violin down in the basement. None of us owned any musical instruments, and we definitely didn't know how to play the violin. We thought maybe there was a music player hidden down there or something. It became a real nuisance, so we searched the basement from top to bottom, but we could never find the source. I remember one day I walked into my bedroom and placed my coins on my bedside table. As I turned to leave the room, I heard a clang. One of the coins had somehow been hurled towards me. Just one of the coins. I had left them in a perfect, neat stack on top of that table. Gradually, the activity in the house seemed to become more and more focused around my youngest sister. One day, she was playing in her room with her cuddly toys. My mum walked into her bedroom to put some washing away in the chest of drawers. The cuddly toys were scattered all across the bedroom floor. My mum was talking to my sister, who followed her back out of the room into the laundry room to help her with the clothes. When they returned to my sister's bedroom just a few minutes later, the cuddly toys were now arranged in a perfect circle on the bedroom floor. My mum was absolutely horrified, but my sister seemed surprisingly unfazed. In winter 2010, everything came to a climax, and my parents had no choice but to put the property up for sale. My little sister started waking up each and every morning with small scratches on her face. Initially, we all presumed that maybe she was just doing it to herself in her sleep. However, we soon realised that this wasn't the case, because she started waking up with scratches on her back, in places that she just couldn't reach. My mum would bath my sister on the evening, and by the morning the scratches would appear. Enough was enough. We received an offer on the house fairly quickly, and thankfully the sale of the house went through quickly with no problems. We moved out of that house and never looked back. We have had no paranormal encounters or experiences since moving out of that house. Thank you for listening.
The story I'm about to tell you took place in the middle of my second semester. During winter break, my roommate decided to bunk our beds. I had gone home and she stayed on campus, so she and her cousin converted the beds. I was excited about it since we had spoken about it before. When I came back to school, I had the bottom bunk, which I was grateful for. Every time my roommate laid on the top bunk, the bottom of her mattress would sag under her weight. I would often put my feet under her mattress and push her in the air, making her jump. We both found it quite funny. She worked for Amazon and had the graveyard shift. On the weekends and a couple of weekdays, she would leave at around 6 p.m. and come back at 5 a.m. in the morning. One particular Friday night, I had returned to my dorm at about 10 p.m. after hanging out with some friends. I knew the room would be empty, as my roommate had left for work hours ago. But I remember I got this really uneasy feeling as soon as I entered the room. It was a feeling I'd never had before. I was stood in the doorway, looking around the room, expecting to see something out of place. But everything looked fine. There was nothing out of place. Nothing looked weird. I just got this funny feeling. I even thought about sleeping in one of my friends' rooms, but I was too exhausted and just brushed it off as tiredness. I changed into my pyjamas, threw on my headphones, and before I knew it, I drifted off to sleep. I had no idea what the time was when I woke up, but I do remember being freezing cold, despite usually being really hot in that room. I remember looking around the room and everything was lit up in a deep red due to my roommate's LED lights. I was confused that they were on, until something caught my attention. I listened attentively, and what I heard was absolute nightmare fuel. I could hear what sounded like a man breathing from up above. It sounded very raspy, but it was very quiet, so I couldn't quite work out if the noise was in my head, or if I was really hearing it. I could feel the uneasiness as it started creeping up my spine. My head whipped around, and I was staring at the sagging mattress above me. I breathed a momentary sigh of relief when I realised it was just my roommate. At this point, I was thinking that she'd snuck someone in while I slept. I put my feet under her mattress and gently pushed. But this time, it felt heavier than usual. Like, a lot heavier. I heard the raspy moan again. This time it was louder, and it was definitely coming from above. The sound of it really stuck dead in me. It sounded like an old man sleeping with his mouth open. It was like the sound a heavy smoker makes when they're struggling for breath. That's the best way to describe it. When I noticed it was pitch black outside, I wondered what time it was. When my roommate got back, the sun was usually peeking through, so I reached for my phone to check the time, and my heart sunk. It was only midnight, and my roommate never got off early, let alone 5 hours early. At this point, I was absolutely terrified, and knew that there was no way I'd be able to sleep until I saw for myself who was in that bed. If she did sneak someone in, I would definitely be kind of pissed, so I really needed to check. I was creeping out of my bed to have a look. The very second my foot hit the floor, that mattress above me shifted. But the sound of it moving wasn't any type of shuffling. It was like all of the weight on that mattress had now been lifted. It scared the absolute hell out of me, so I quickly ran to flick on the light and turned around to face the bed. My hairs stood on end, and I started to cry the very moment I realised that there was nobody else in the room. I just remember feeling absolutely terrified. I felt like all the blood had been drained out of my body. The whole thing felt like it lasted a few hours, when in reality, it was only really a few minutes. There was nobody else awake at this hour, so I called some of my friends from back home, since I was still a few hours ahead of them. I was crying on the phone, explaining to them exactly what had happened. I had all the lights on in the room, and was sitting at my desk while I was talking to them. But I got the impression they weren't taking me seriously. I hung up the phone, feeling agitated and exhausted, but knew there was no way I was going to get back to sleep. I watched TV until my roommate arrived back home and explained to her what had happened. Surprisingly, my roommate laughed it off. That was until she climbed up onto her bunk. Just then, her attitude shifted. She asked me if I had been up onto her bunk. Of course, I said no. When I asked why, she said because her bed was messy, and before she'd left for work, she definitely made it. She also said that her pillow absolutely reeked of cigarettes. Neither of us have ever smoked in our lives. After this incident, I could never sleep with the lights off in that room. The sound of that raspy moaning and the sound of the mattress have really stuck with me since. When I go back next year, I won't be having a roommate. Which is probably a good thing, since me and her departed on bad terms. I have had other paranormal encounters, but this creeped me out the most by far. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Let us know in the comments. I want to say this all started at the beginning of this year, so let's get right into it. I'm going to give a backstory of the house I live in for a bit of context. I live in a very spacious home in Connecticut with my boyfriend and his family. The house was built in 2000 and I've lived here for 3 years. My boyfriend and I live in the basement, which is fully finished. It's basically our own apartment. One of the very first things that appeared weird to me about this property is that when you search for it on Google Maps, it comes up as a church cemetery. When you Google that cemetery though, it's set about a mile down the road on the other end. A weird little coincidence, I think. Anyway, I started noticing out of the corner of my eye a greyish-white shadow moving in the kitchen at night. Initially, I chalked it up to me seeing things, because that night I had had a drink, so I just let it go. Well, eventually I started seeing this figure multiple times per week, even when I hadn't had a drink. At this point, I started finding it pretty creepy. The figure was tall and slim, but I couldn't really see any distinguishing facial features. It was more of a side profile, a quick glance, then it would disappear. Fast forward to the 6th of March this year, when I noticed a Facebook post by my partner's mother. She and I both work in hospitals, and she asked if anybody else in healthcare had ever brought a spirit home. She went on to say that she often felt like she was being watched while she was at home. So I sent her a message explaining to her about the figure that I'd been seeing in the basement. After I told her this, I believe she burned sage all around the house, and things seemed to die down for a while. Honestly, everything was really good for about a month. I wasn't seeing the shadow anymore, and she no longer had that feeling of being watched. Then, on April 24th, my boyfriend's mother posted on Facebook again, saying that she needed a house cleansing immediately. She said things had been good for a while, but that the activity had started again and escalated. She had started hearing knocking on the walls and doors, and the dogs had started barking at all hours through the night. Well, that night, I woke up at some point during the night because I really needed to pee. I swung my legs over, and the second my feet touched the floor, the printer in the corner of the room by the kitchen switched itself on. The light from the printer illuminated every inch of the basement. Then, it started to print something. When I checked the tray to look at the printed piece of paper, a chill ran down my spine. On that piece of paper was a human handprint. It was faint, but it was definitely there. It creeped the hell out of me, so I unplugged the printer, climbed back into bed, and tried to get some sleep. Around a week later, I was in bed again, and my boyfriend was fast asleep. Since the incident with the printer, I was really having trouble sleeping, so I was barely asleep. All of a sudden, I was jolted awake and alerted to the feeling of something really heavy hitting the side of the bed. I sat up and looked all around the room, at which point I could feel cold breath on my face and something was moving my hair. This absolutely scared the shit out of me. All I could do was pull the covers up to my head and once again try my best to get some sleep. On May 10th, she posted again on Facebook to say that she'd seen a greyish-black mass floating around the house. That specific night, me and my boyfriend were in Maine for the weekend, and we came home the following day. I hadn't seen this Facebook post until 2 days later, on the 12th of May, which was Mother's Day. This day just happened to be the 1-year anniversary of having my baby removed due to a 3rd trimester miscarriage. However, I was enjoying the day with my boyfriend's family and went inside to get some food. As I was standing at the island in the middle of the kitchen, I could see something moving. It was a black, floating shadow, and it was low to the ground. It wasn't tall whatsoever. I watched in absolute shock as it floated down the hallway towards the door to our basement. Well, I asked my mother-in-law about her experience with the shadow and where she'd seen it. She'd seen it in exactly the same place that I saw it. As we stood there talking about it, the smoke alarms randomly started going off. I want to say at this point, my boyfriend's mother, his sister, and myself had all experienced things in that house over the past few months. My boyfriend and his father, however, hadn't seen or heard anything. I'm now absolutely terrified to be in the house alone. I just get this really awful, oppressive feeling. A woman at work is a paranormal investigator in her spare time, and I was explaining my situation to her. She interrupted me abruptly and asked me if I burn candles in my home. I responded yes, occasionally, but not recently. She said, I have something telling me, go ahead, light that candle. But then she said, for God's sake, whatever you do, please do not light any candles. We also just found out that the original house on that property was destroyed in a fire, and this house was built in its place. The original detached garage is still there though. I am beyond freaked out, and am seriously considering moving out altogether. What are your thoughts?
This is a really long story, but it's 100% true. Going back 25 years now, I moved in with my cousin and her co-worker/roommate, Jose. The house was an old cement block, 3-bedroom, 1 bathroom, with a large fenced yard. Jose had 2 very large German shepherds that lived there, but they were mostly kept in the yard. The house itself is in Claremore, Florida, in a shitty, packed suburban neighbourhood. Nothing special whatsoever. But the rent was cheap, $50 a week from what I remember, and the house was clean and tidy. Plus, my cousin lived there too, so I moved in and we all got along really well. Everyone worked. We all had our own busy lives, so we pretty much kept ourselves to ourselves and saw each other for a few minutes here and there. I lived there very happily for around 6 months. However, the story I'm about to tell you was the reason for me moving out. I'm pretty sure you'll understand why. It was a weekend night, and we all happened to be off work at the same time. We decided to make an occasion of it and invite some of our friends around from the local pool hall that we frequented. Jose also invited a few people over from the pharmaceutical lab that he worked at. There was probably about 20 people there in total. We played music and did a lot of things that young people do. Eventually, it got pretty late, and we found ourselves talking about ghosts and the paranormal on a wider scale. My cousin and I are from a really spiritual family, so we both had some really interesting stories to tell. Everybody got involved, and we were all really into the discussion. Jose, however, remained quiet throughout most of the conversation. He waited until we'd all quietened down a little bit, and then he said, "This house is haunted." My cousin and I both shot each other a look, and then laughed, because yes, Jose's 20-pound cat sometimes meows at something in the hallway, but that's pretty much it. He proceeded to tell us that there was a presence in the house, but it mostly stayed in the backyard, and in the shed in particular. This tiny, pink, little old wooden shed that I'd never even looked in. He told us that he always keeps the curtains in his bedroom closed. This is because his window faces that shed, and the door to the shed will never stay closed. He said he's jammed it shut a million times, but it will never stay shut. It really creeps him out. He said he could always tell when it was in the house, because he'd waken up feeling down and depressed. This really gave me the chills. I certainly didn't want to think that I was living with a presence, and I didn't like the idea that it was having a negative effect on my roommate. I was a tough chick, in my opinion, so I piped up and said, "Fuck that ghost. I'll shut that shed door, and you won't have to keep your curtains closed anymore." I said all this because I didn't genuinely believe that there was a ghost in the house or in that shed. I believed that we were all just fucking around, So, I told them all that I was going outside to inspect that shed and shut the door once and for all. Everyone followed me as we were all walking around the outside of the house. Jose told me that this was a really bad idea and asked me to reconsider. He said that whatever it was really wanted that door open and that I should just leave it alone. We all got to the shed and it was exactly what I thought it would be. A very worn down wooden shed that looked oddly more like a house than it did a shed. I looked inside and there was an old lawnmower, some old paint pots, some rusty screens, and darkness. Pure darkness. I looked around outside and found a rusty old shovel by the corner of the garage. I took the shovel over to the shed and kicked the door of the shed back into the frame. The door was closed, jammed shut, literally kicked back into the frame. The door itself was a really tight fit to the frame, so it took a considerable amount of force to get it back in. I took the handle of the shovel and placed it underneath the handle of the shed door. I shoved it into the ground as hard as I possibly could. It was secure. It wasn't budging at all. We all went back inside and bullshitted a little bit more, but it was very late. I'm going to say roughly 1 AM by the time we got back in, and everybody kind of started to say their goodbyes. We let the dogs out of their pen in the yard and locked the gate. We made sure the front gate was locked so they couldn't get out, straightened up the house, and eventually we all went to bed. Sometime around 6 AM, I woke up because I really needed to pee. I opened my bedroom door, but I was still very sleepy. As I opened my bedroom door, there was a really loud and awful sound, and it startled the hell out of me. It was like the sound of fingernails scraping on a blackboard. You know the sound. I opened the door all the way, and something fell through the doorway and hit me on the leg. I was still very much in a daze, so it took a few seconds for me to register exactly what had just fallen and hit me. But when I realised what it was, my blood ran cold. I can't even begin to put into words how I felt in that moment. It was the shovel. The very same shovel that I'd used to jam the door shut on that creepy old shed. The shovel had been standing against my bedroom door. There was a tiny pile of dirt where the tip had been sat against the tile floor of the hallway. I rushed through the house. I checked the side door, which was still locked, and I went out into the yard. Of course, the shed door was now wide open. I felt like all the blood had been drained from my body, and I couldn't breathe. I ran back into the house, locking the door behind me in a panic. I immediately started pounding on Jose and my cousin's bedroom doors. I was absolutely terrified, but also livid at the same time. I absolutely knew that one of them was behind this little prank. I know that whoever is listening to or reading this story wasn't there to see the reaction on their faces. But I can absolutely guarantee neither of them did it. Jose literally started to weep. He was begging me to tell him that I was lying. He also begged my cousin to admit that she had done it. When neither of us would take responsibility, he went out to the store to buy some religious candles, produced a rosary, and started to pray for whatever it was to leave us in peace, or pray for me for being so damn stupid. My Spanish wasn't even close to being fluent enough to keep up with his prayers. My cousin, on the other hand, was pissed. Really pissed. She was practically ready to fight me. She was absolutely adamant that I was pulling a prank and cussed me up and down. She called me a liar and said that I was just a child. But most of all, she said she really didn't appreciate being woken up at 6 AM in the morning after a night of partying to be a pawn in my stupid little prank. When I realised that neither of them had put that shovel against my bedroom door or reopened the shed door, I was absolutely terrified. There was no way on earth someone had gotten into the yard, past the dogs, got the shed door open, got into the locked house and placed that shovel against my door. I didn't sleep there again without someone else in the room with me. Every moment I spent in that house after this was beyond tense. We all kind of stopped talking to each other, and Jose and my cousin ended up in a terrible argument. Jose's bedroom backs directly onto my cousin's bedroom wall, and he accused her of banging on the wall at all hours, a claim she strongly denies. My cousin ended up finding somewhere else to live, and was out of there within a week. It took me 2 weeks to find another place to live, and I've never been back since. But you might have guessed. Until the day I moved out of that house, Jose was still complaining about banging on the bedroom wall. The really creepy thing is, my cousin's bedroom door has remained locked since she moved out. I attended a college with a long history of paranormal activity. In one of the old dorms, there's a suite that's completely blocked off. This suite is supposedly haunted, and the only way that you can break into it is via the suite next door. Ironically, this suite is a designated party room. Rumour has it that a former student ended their life in that room approximately 30 years ago, and has haunted it ever since. As time went on, more and more students refused to reside in that room due to the unexplainable level of phenomenon that would occur in there. There had been claims of disembodied voices crying in the night, and students would suffer from depressive and sometimes suicidal thoughts while sleeping in that room. So, eventually, the college just blocked it off. Me, my friend, and a bunch of other people once broke into that suite out of sheer curiosity more than anything else. The whole place was empty as expected, all apart from a single chair which sat directly in the middle of the common room. That chair is said to be there so that the student's spirit has somewhere to sit, so that he won't bother people. Although, other rumours suggest that this was the chair that the student used to hang himself. Unbeknown to me at the time, one of the other guys had bought an Ouija board, so we used it to try to communicate with the spirit. We didn't receive any definitive answers, although through a series of yes and no questions, it did seem that we were indeed talking to the boy's spirit. As we were coming to the end of the session, the planchette just seemed to be moving quickly between yes and no. Just as we informed the spirit of our intention to end the session, the door violently slammed shut right in front of our eyes. There was absolutely no wind, as the entire place was sealed off. We checked every single room to make sure that the place was empty when we first entered. At that, we all bolted and left the place well alone. Fast forward a few years, I was teaching at a small high school. The building was pretty new,
and was in relatively good condition. My classroom was fine, and there was no spooky or paranormal vibes in there at all. Well, for the first few months at least. I bought in 2 portraits to hang on the wall. One of a male politician and the other of a female activist. I taught social studies, so I felt that they were relevant to my lessons. I hung them on 2 pieces of metal drilled into the wall using round hooks. One day, after the school day had finished and all the students had gone home, I was in the classroom and the portrait of the woman fell to the floor. Over the following weeks, this happened a number of times, and each time it fell, I made sure that it was fixed securely to the wall. I even tried pulling downwards on it and knocking it to see if it fell down easily, which it didn't. I had carpeted floors, so it wasn't damaged. It was just annoying and creepy. My co-workers started joking that a sexist ghost was haunting my room. None of the windows on this floor could be opened, so I couldn't even blame it on the wind. And when the portrait fell, I was in the room with the door closed, so I literally had no explanation. One day, as usual, I was in the classroom on my own marking some work, and the portrait fell. But I most certainly was not in the mood. I cursed out loud at whatever was causing the portrait to fall. At this point, I didn't actually believe that there was a ghost haunting the room. I just yelled into the void out of sheer frustration. Eventually, I just decided to remove both of the portraits as I just had enough. After that, however, the focus seemed to shift to something else. The clock that I had up on the wall in that classroom for some time suddenly started falling down multiple times per week. The clock had never ever fallen down before and was only ever taken down from the wall when the batteries needed replacing. Now, I was starting to believe that there might just be a paranormal explanation for what was going on. Finally, once again, I was in the classroom on my own after the school day had finished. I was just preparing lessons for the following day when I was disturbed by the sound of knocking on the classroom door. I shouted, "Come in," expecting my colleague to enter, but there was no response. Thinking maybe they hadn't heard me, I repeated myself louder, "Come in." At which point, the classroom door slowly started creeping open on its own, but there was nobody there. I got up, walked out into the corridor and called out. There was definitely nobody there. There's CCTV everywhere in that school, so I went straight to the janitor's office and asked to see the CCTV footage. And there it was, clear as day. We could see the handle of that classroom door turning on its own before the door slowly crept open. Needless to say, we were absolutely gobsmacked. One day, a fellow teacher who was in one of the rooms next to mine called me into her room for a chat. We ended up on the subject of paranormal experiences in the school, and she said she believed that both of our rooms were haunted. She too had experienced things falling and moving around the room on their own. The teacher, who was in my room before me, constantly complained about an uneasy feeling and found any excuse not to be in that room alone. I later found out that that school used to be used as an orphanage. I'm not sure if this is an explanation for the hauntings, but something in those rooms is definitely seeking attention. Thankfully, the following term I was moved to a classroom on the other side of the school, and I haven't had any ghostly experiences since moving. I'm a freshman in college, and I've had more than just one paranormal encounter. But this is by far the most terrifying experience of my life. I attend an all-girls Catholic school, and it's well over 100 years old. It has a cemetery on campus for the nuns who have attended there. That's not really relevant to this story, but I just wanted to provide some context. Anyway, it was about 10 PM on a weekday, and I started getting the urge to pee, and I really needed to use the restroom. I tended to use the restroom in the basement. I hate going to the restroom on my floor, because somebody is always in there, and I like my privacy. Before I tell you this next part, I just want to say that this is something I've done many times. I've never faced any problems until that day. Safe to say, after this happened, I'll never be using the bathroom down there again. So, as I mentioned, I use the restroom in the basement. Despite what happened to me down there, I should point out that the basement doesn't look like what you probably think it looks like. It actually looks pretty decent, and it connects to the first floor lobby via a small staircase. So, up until this point, I was never afraid. Not only that, but the restroom down there is actually pretty nice and clean. When the elevator brought me down to the basement, I walked into the restroom getting ready to do my business. When I opened the bathroom door, the first thing I noticed was that one of the stalls was closed. I was surprised, because in all the times I've been down here, there's hardly ever anyone down there. Well, besides one freshman teammate of mine who does the same. So, initially thinking it was her, I called out to her, but was met with silence. With curiosity getting the better of me, I peered underneath the stall door, expecting to see her blue Crocs. Except, I could see no feet. There was nothing there at all. At this point, I'll admit, I was a bit creeped out. So I figured that someone was probably just embarrassed that I'd walked in and picked their feet up off the floor so they couldn't be seen. I decided to leave them alone. But, as I turned my back to leave, that's when something absolutely terrifying happened. So terrifying, in fact, that I simply turned and ran as fast as I could. It sounded like the toilet paper in that stall was being violently and rapidly pulled out of the dispenser. It was being pulled so fast that I could hear the dispenser vibrating loudly. I looked down to the bottom of the door, and I could see that the toilet paper was piling up inside the stall. My heart was racing in my chest. I tried to rationalise and convince myself that somebody was in there and that they were just in a rush. In one last, desperate attempt, with a shaky voice I called out again. But this time, I was met with a series of deafeningly loud bangs on the door of that stall. So, as I said, I turned and ran as fast as I could. I left and headed towards the elevator. I pushed the button and eagerly awaited the doors to open. Then, the banging from inside the bathroom suddenly stopped. The lift was taking forever, and I was anxiously praying for it to hurry up. I could really feel my pulse racing by now. Just as I was losing my patience, I heard the stall door from inside the bathroom slam open against the wall. It flew open as if somebody had kicked it. The lift still hadn't arrived, so at this point I knew that taking the stairs was the smart option. The stairwell is located right next to the elevator, so I wasted no time. I opened the basement door, and just as I stepped into the stairwell, I heard the bathroom door slam open. Once again, it was as if somebody had kicked it with enough force to make it slam against the wall. My brain was telling me that it was just a person who was in a rush. My body didn't give me chance to turn around and check. Just as I made it up the first flight of stairs, the most horrifying thing happened. The basement door that I had just walked through smashed open again. It was at this point that my heart sank as I realised my worst fear. I realised I was wrong. This was not a person. Whatever it was now right behind me. I could clearly hear loud, heavy footsteps quickly climbing the stairs directly behind me, and they were approaching me at an alarming rate. But the most terrifying part of this whole nightmare scenario was that I could see nobody there. I was absolutely scared shitless, but I went straight into survival mode. I had already passed the first floor door, and I only lived on the second floor. So I started running faster than I ever knew I was capable of. The other set of footsteps seemed to be echoing louder and louder throughout the stairwell. I was panicking, fumbling with my keys, trying to get them ready to open the door. When I reached my front door, my heart was pounding, and I unlocked it as fast as I possibly could. I could still hear those footsteps getting closer and louder. I ran inside, slammed the door behind me and bolted it shut. I slid down to the ground with my back against the door and waited in silence. Just a second later, the same loud footsteps ran through the hall and sounded like they'd stopped dead in the middle of the corridor. Nervously, I stood up and looked through the peephole. I was hoping to God that I might see my teammate and that this was just all an elaborate hoax. But, again, I could see nothing, apart from the stairwell door slowly closing. There was absolutely nobody there. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door. I ran into the middle of that area to look down the hallway, but still, I could see nothing. There was absolutely nowhere to hide, and it wasn't humanly possible for anyone to run that fast. I still try to reason with myself and convince myself that it was just a person and they were in a rush and I hadn't seen them. But the sound of that toilet dispenser, the banging on the toilet door, and the sound of those footsteps chasing me up the stairs, it all still haunts me to this day. The whole incident was totally spine-chilling. The only thing I'm absolutely certain about is that I'll never go down there to use the bathroom again.
Before my parents got divorced, my mum and I lived in Mexico with my dad and my grandparents. I really have no idea how old this place was. From what I know, my grandpa's family has owned the land of this huge area of the city for generations. It used to be a hacienda before they started splitting up the land amongst themselves. Some of the family sold their share and others stayed. So the property itself was kind of a combination of some old traditional buildings and some newer modern buildings. Anyway, when I was about 5 years old, I started waking up in the middle of the night, complaining to my mum that there was a girl in my room and she wouldn't let me sleep. My mum obviously presumed that I was just having nightmares, or that I'd been watching scary movies and was now facing the consequences. She did let me sleep in their room, but she was growing more and more concerned that I kept having the same nightmares. She says I always seemed more annoyed than scared, though as time went on, she started to question whether it really was just nightmares. For context, my mum is hugely skeptical and quite the level-headed person, though ghosts were never even considered as a possibility. For now, at least. My dad was a lot more open-minded. He was definitely a believer in the paranormal. This is because of all the things that he'd experienced and seen growing up in that house. He was the one insisting that there was something way more sinister at play here than just nightmares or scary movies. My parents had a pull-out couch in their bedroom and decided to let me sleep there until I felt ready to sleep back in my own room. However, every time I tried to sleep back in my room, the nightmares would persist, and inevitably, I'd always return to my parents' bedroom. My mum asked me what this girl looked like. I described her as a little bit older than me, with long dark hair that covered her face and a tatty white dress. I said that she would wake me up wanting to play with me, and if I refused, she'd become aggressive or expose her face to me, which I said looked like it was rotting. My mum thought that maybe my sister had made me watch The Ring with her, but I insisted that this girl was real. My sister absolutely denied ever letting me watch that movie. It kept on like this until one particular night when my mum was woken up by what sounded like a girl's voice in their bedroom. She says she looked over to where I was, and there I was fast asleep on that pull-out couch. Out of nowhere, a shadow passed over me, and I was being pulled up by the front of my shirt into an upright position. I woke up, terrified, screaming, with that girl's rotting face right in front of my own. My mum rushed over, scooping me up in her arms, and my dad was frantically yelling to wake up my grandma. It all pretty much stopped when my grandma called in a priest and started leaving rosaries and a figurine of the Virgin Mary under my pillow. It was all very horror movie-esque, but it was also far from the last weird thing ever to occur in that house. For years, my grandpa had been telling us that there was money buried under the house. It's a very common superstition in Mexico. Some say that only the person that's been shown where the money is in a dream can ever really attain it, while others say the person that finds the money will die. My grandpa was the one being constantly accosted by the spirit of a woman telling him where the money is. My mum used to tease him about having already lived long enough and that he should really start to consider his grandchildren's inheritance. My grandpa was always a really good sport about my mum's joking, but what he told us sounds genuinely terrifying. He said, like me, he was often woken up by something in the middle of the night. When he rolled over in bed, he would see something staring at him from out of the darkness. There were also times he complained about being pulled out of bed by an unseen force. He often dreamt about a woman offering to tell him where the money was, in exchange for 3 masses at a specific church. Sometimes she would offer him her hand, but it would always be covered and concealed by her dress. This gave my grandpa cause for concern. He did seem to oblige at first though, asking my grandma to go to church and request the first 2 masses. However, when she went to church to request the 3rd mass, the priest refused, unless my grandpa went to speak to him personally. My grandpa refused to go for some reason, so the 3rd mass never happened. He would also say that sometimes he could see a specific spot on the floor in the house glowing, but refused to say exactly where it was. Any time I tell people these stories, they always seem to think that I'm just retelling horror stories, which I suppose is understandable. There are many, many more stories passed down from generations about that house, but these stories are the most personal ones to me. So, back in 2014, my family and I, me, my mum, my stepdad, and my two brothers, all moved into a big old house as a blended family. It really was the perfect horror movie house. It was situated at the edge of town, opposite a cemetery. It was between 200 and 300 years old, and it backed onto an abandoned hospital building. Anyway, we lived there for about 4 years until we moved into our current house, which is only a 2-minute walk down the road. But ever since we lived there, I can't stop thinking about all the weird, strange, scary shit that occurred. I've even gone as far as contacting local archives, etc., to find out more information on the history of the property. It was absolutely horrendous, and I still have to drive past that house every day. I'll try to describe in as much detail as I possibly can some of the instances that occurred in that house. So, on our very first day and night in that house, our garden, as I said, backed onto an old, ruined, abandoned hospital with large grounds, etc. Only our garden fence separated this from us. The first afternoon/evening that we lived in that house, my brothers and I created a makeshift football goal out of logs leaning up against a tree at the bottom of our garden. We played around for a while, but when we got bored, we decided to go exploring in the hospital grounds. We were gone for less than an hour, but when we came back and walked past our goalposts, somebody had gathered all the sticks and logs and arranged them in these super neat piles. It sounds really stupid, but there's no way they could have just fallen that way. Me and my brothers were so freaked out that our parents eventually told us that it was them that did it, even though this wasn't the truth, and eventually they admitted to us that they were freaked out too. One day, they were getting really pissed off with me and my brothers. They said, "For God's sake, stop watering that plant. It really doesn't need that much water, you're going to kill it." My brothers and I were fairly young at this stage, and to be quite honest, we didn't even know which plant they were talking about. A few days passed, and our parents were really pissed. They told us the plant was dying and we really needed to stop it. It even went as far as them moving and hiding the plant in different locations. But nothing worked, and eventually the plant died. To this day, my brothers still swear to God that it wasn't them, and I believe them. So, for the next incident, my mum was standing in the doorway to my bedroom talking to me. She saw my younger brother walk out of his doorway to his bedroom down the hallway towards the bathroom. This might sound pretty normal, and initially she thought nothing of it. However, when she walked downstairs just a few seconds later, she was absolutely horrified to notice that both of my brothers were sitting on the sofa with my stepdad watching football on the TV. My mum doesn't believe in the paranormal at all, but she was super freaked out by this. This was followed by general, constant activity all around the house. We had 2 dogs that were extremely well behaved, but they started acting really weird in a specific area in the garden. They'd snarl and growl at first, but then they'd lie down and whine and cry, as if somebody was shouting at them. This started happening every damn night. I had a wooden sign hanging on some string on the back of my bedroom door. Every night, just after midnight, the sign would start banging on the door as if somebody was knocking. We had no windows at all in the upstairs hallway, so there's no way that this could have been caused by a draft. Eventually, my dad removed the string and screwed the sign to the door. This seemed to work at first. Well, for a few nights at least. There was no knocking, no waking up in the middle of the night. It was bliss. Until it wasn't. One night, I had fallen into a deep sleep. I was dreaming about something totally random when I was disturbed from my sleep by a series of knocks on my bedroom door. I woke up, still kind of in a daze, wondering what was going on. Then, again, 3 knocks on the bedroom door. By this point, I was getting really scared and pulled my covers up over my head. However, after a few seconds, there was 3 huge slams on the bedroom door, as if somebody was trying to cave the door in with a sledgehammer. It was absolutely terrifying, and so loud in fact that it woke up my whole family. My parents came rushing into my room to see what all the commotion was, but they could clearly see that me and both my brothers were still in bed. We were all really shaken up by this incident, and didn't really know what to do. In the end, my parents placed the house up for sale. We moved out and moved into our current home. Thankfully, we've had no such experiences since moving here. Have you ever had to move home due to paranormal activity?
I have experienced many paranormal encounters in my life. But this story is from my time in college, and it spanned over a year. One particular night, I was on FaceTime with my now former roommate, while we were all home for the holidays. They were complaining that they could hear some weird noises coming from the attic, and they decided to investigate. This is despite me, who has always lived in a haunted house, strongly advising them not to. But she decided to investigate anyway. With me still on FaceTime, she climbed the steps to the attic, opened the hatch, and flicked on the light switch. It was difficult for me to gauge exactly what was going on. Even with the light on, it was still very dim. I was still strongly advising her to leave it alone and go back downstairs, but, against my better judgment, she persisted. What happened next in that attic was absolutely horrifying. But first, I want to fast forward to a few days later when we were in our apartment. My partner, who was living with us at the time, started complaining about hearing our voices calling out to him while he showered. Initially, I just thought he was messing with us. However, before long I started hearing it too, but with my roommate's voice only. Late one night, I could clearly hear my roommate's closet door opening and slamming shut over and over again. I could hear her laughing too, which really started to agitate me. Eventually, I sent her a text message, asking her politely to keep the noise down, as I had a class early the next day. She sent me a text back immediately, and her response sent a shiver down my spine. She sent me a Snapchat of her at work. She wasn't in her room. My partner was also at work, so at this moment I realised I was in the apartment alone. We didn't have any neighbours. The rooms next to us were vacant, and the new tenants weren't moving in for a few weeks. So, nervously and apprehensively, I slowly crept down the hallway towards her room. At this point, the banging and the laughter had both stopped. It really felt like something was waiting for me on the other side of that door. I slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open. I'm not sure exactly what I was expecting, but my heart was going 10 to the dozen. To my surprise, the room was exactly as she'd left it. Trying not to pry too much, I had a quick look around and opened her closet door. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I made a sigh of relief, thinking maybe it was all in my head. Boy, was I wrong. I closed the closet door, turned around, and made my way back out of the room. And that is when I heard it. Laughter. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned around to face her room. The closet door that I had literally just closed was now open again. Make no mistake, I bolted straight back to my room and barricaded myself in. Fortunately, there was no more activity that night, but that didn't stop me from sleeping with the light on. COVID hit soon after, and my roommate couldn't justify staying in the apartment when the lease came to an end, especially since the rest of the school was closed for the foreseeable future due to the pandemic. She moved back to her parents, while me and my partner searched for a new place because neither of us wanted to move back in with our parents. We found a place pretty quickly and moved in. It was slightly smaller than our last place, but it was nice. However, before long, I started suffering from sleep paralysis and the voices returned. I was still hearing my former roommate's voice whenever I showered, and now I was hearing my partner's voice too. It wasn't faint, it was clear and deliberate, and it scared the absolute shit out of me. My partner mentioned the same thing. We were having similar encounters with each other's voices. On one occasion, I heard the bathroom door unlock, open and shut, followed by the sound of my partner saying my name. I asked him what he wanted, but he didn't respond. I peeked around the shower curtain only to see that the door was still closed and locked. We suffered many sleepless nights together in that apartment, but thankfully we weren't there for much longer. We terminated the lease agreement with the landlord because he failed to tell us that there was a loud rooftop bar which shared a wall with us. He offered us a coupon to the bar, which we abruptly declined. We terminated the lease on the grounds of breach of trust on their end, legally allowing us to move out without penalty. My partner's parents allowed us to move into their lake house while we searched for a new place. It was convenient for us because it was close to where I worked and it was close enough to the school. But before long, again, we were both hearing voices whenever we were alone. I remember one night I was abruptly woken up in the middle of the night by the sound of banging behind our headboard. I could also hear a loud voice yelling at us to wake up. Initially, I thought it was my partner's mother, as the voice sounded very similar to hers. My partner jumped up and went to investigate, but there was nobody there. I started receiving text messages from my former roommate saying that she was constantly seeing and hearing things, and she was apologising for not listening to me when I told her not to go into that attic. Which brings me back to that night. She was rummaging around in the attic for a few minutes when she came across a dusty old box. She opened the box and described it to me as a board game with a series of letters and numbers. She had no idea what it was, but I knew instantly that this was an Ouija board. I immediately told her to put it back in the box and leave it the hell alone, and for once she actually listened to me. As she put the box back where she found it, she said that she could hear something from over by the hatch in the attic. She stopped moving and fell silent, as we both listened intently. I could hear it too. It was a voice, and it was saying, "I told you not to go up there, but you wouldn't listen." But this voice was instantly recognisable. It was my voice, and with that, the hatch to the attic slammed shut. I stayed on the call with her, as she eventually worked up the courage to open the hatch and descend the steps. Thankfully, the rest of that night was uneventful. Me and my boyfriend soon found a new apartment and moved out of the lake house. My ex-roommate had her home blessed, and her parents cleared out the attic. They sent the Ouija board to an antiques dealer that specialises in paranormal artifacts. Thankfully, all of the paranormal activity came to an end for all of us. As I mentioned, I've had many paranormal experiences and encounters growing up. But that year was, without doubt, the most terrifying year of my life.